Hello, this is the Daily Bread Guide message of Pastor David. Today's scripture is Genesis chapter 21. I divided Genesis chapter 21 into three paragraphs. Verse 1 to 8, the birth of promised son Isaac, the promise fulfilled. Verse 9 to 21, Hagar and Ishmael expelled, the result of disobedience. Hagar and Ishmael expelled, the result of disobedience. Verse 22 to 34, Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, the wisdom of Beersheba. Let's go to verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. The verse 1 keeps as that God did as he had said, as he had promised. One thing we can be sure is that all God would say to us, all God says to us will be fulfilled. There is no promise of God that will go unfulfilled. And the promise, fulfill the promise of God is the greatest joy of our lives. Verse 6 to 7, Sarah said, God had brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. This is the greatest joy of our lives. When we fulfill God's promise in our lives, it's just a joy that cannot be compared to any other joy in the world, in our lives. When the promise is fulfilled, it brings the laughter and joy in our lives. But when there's a disobedience, pain begins in our lives. Pain begins when we disobey and make impatient decisions. The result of impatient decision was the birth of Ishmael. And that brought Abraham such a pain. Especially in order to fulfill God's promises in our lives, the result of the impatient decision, the result of our disobedience must be amended to fulfill the promise of God. And that essentially causes conflict and pain. Verse 9 to 12. So when Isaac was growing, Hagar and Ishmael was mocking Isaac. There was a conflict between the two sons and the two mothers. And when that happened, God actually honors Sarah. Verse 10, and she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Actually, this might seem as a very humanistic and emotional speech to Abraham of Sarah, but Sarah had a very clear understanding about God's promise, because she mentions that that slave woman's son Ishmael will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. That statement just proves that Sarah had a clear understanding about the inheritance, about the promise of God. So actually, verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it opened it concerned he concerned his son. So that brought the conflict uh, inside of Abraham and also between the two sons. And as an answer of this conflict in Abraham, God answers, verse 12. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and the maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. This is somehow against our um, uh, emotion, right? Like a humanistic emotion. So what God is saying is that you must lay down humanistic emotions in our decisions. When we are making decisions, we must obey to the God's voice. We must make a spiritual decisions. Here, God is just constantly pursuing the fulfillment of His promises. And this must be the lifestyle of believers. We are not the people who would try to be good in a human way, but we are the people who would make decisions in a spiritual way. And sometimes obeying God's voice, obeying God's commandment may seem not so humanistic or emotionally right. Sometimes we must make a hard choice because that is what God gives us to obey, and eventually that will bear the good fruit, while the impatient emotional decisions may seem right at that point. However, that will bear a painful and painful fruit and the conflicts in your life, just as the birth of Ishmael. So, and having that understanding, Abraham obeys to the seemingly unemotional guidance, voice of the Holy Spirit, voice of God. Verse 14. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. So Abraham eventually makes the hard decision to send her maidservant and his son away. Obedience is the blessing. By obeying, Abraham bore the son Isaac, and by disobedience, Abraham got the son Ishmael. So disobedience will produce pain in your life. So I bless you to choose to obey the Lord. That might seem not easy emotionally at that point of decision. However, eventually, the obedience will bear a good fruit, because this is God, a sovereign God who knows everything, who tells you to obey. And just as God commanded Abraham, God protected Hagar and Ishmael in the following verses. This is the mercy and the goodness of God. Verse 17 and 18. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." Verse 18. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So God knows everything. So this is a result of trusting God. Abraham trusted God and obeyed to the Lord, and then God Himself became the provider and the protector of Ishmael and Hagar. Verse 19. The God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Verse 20, God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. So God speaks to Hagar when she prays. And God blesses Ishmael. His love is also upon Ishmael as well. And God promised Abraham that Ishmael will be blessed and become a nation, become a great nation. So one thing we must remember, salvation comes from the seed of Abraham. However, the salvation that came from the seed of Abraham is not only for the seed of Abraham, but also for everyone. So God's love is for everyone. So just the God's promise must be fulfilled from the seed of Abraham, from the descendant of Abraham, from Isaac, Jacob. Verse 22 to 34 is a story about making a treaty between Abraham and Abimelech at Beersheba. And we can see the wisdom of Abraham here. Verse 22 to 23. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you're living as an alien the same kindness I have shown you. So here, the Phicol, the commander of the Abimelech's forces, says, God is with you in everything you do. So they understand that God's favor is upon Abraham. And in return, Abraham says yes to the proposal of the peace treaty. So we must understand the well, having a well in the is one of the most important issues in the wilderness for the survival. So, but at that time, Abraham doesn't just go on without without anything, but Abraham clearly complains. When he has something to say, he just plainly speaks to Abimelech. Verse 25. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. So he mentions about it before he signs the treaty. So, and after mentioning about this, then Abraham makes the peace treaty. Verse 28 to 30. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So from here we can find the wisdom of Abraham. Abraham makes it official and openly state and proclaim that that this well is mine at the place of peace treaty. And for that, Abraham was willing to sacrifice some loss. He was giving some extra loss to Abimelech, but he was willing to take that cost to make it official, make it close, make it neatly closed. The issue is neatly closed. So this is the wisdom that we can learn from Abraham. So when you are beginning something, of course, that's very important, but it's also very important when you are closing an issue. So when you are closing an issue, close it well. When you are breaking up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, make it clear and make it official, and just make it state it clear that we are breaking up now, but I just bless you, and this is it. This is the end. Do not look back, because and make it official. Make it just plain and clear. And for that, do not hesitate to give some loss, like to take some loss as well. Even if that even if it may seem not cost effective at that time, but eventually it will bear a good fruit. When you close it well, it will be much better when you start it again, started another issue. So and verse 33 and 34 states the reasons of blessing upon Abraham. 33, Abraham planted the tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. So first reason of blessing upon Abraham was always the same. He worshipped. Every place he go, he worshipped God. He built the altar and worshipped the Lord. And the second reason of blessing upon Abraham is verse 34, and he says, Abraham stayed in the land of Philistines for a long time. He stayed for a long time. And how was this possible? By his wisdom, because he made this open agreement with Abimelech that this well belongs to Abraham. He could live by the well for a long time. Even if it costed, at that time, it was not really cost effective. It costed 7 ewe lambs for Abraham, but because Abraham made it official and clear that this well belongs to Abraham, he could live there for a long time. So in today's chapter 21, we can learn the wisdom of Abraham. Even though at that time it was a hard decision for Abraham, Abraham made it clear that Sarah has the authority of the maidservant Hagar. Even though Hagar bore a son for Abraham, and even though that was heartbreaking to send Hagar away, Abraham obeyed to the Lord and made it official and clear that Sarah is his wife. Sarah and Isaac is the wife and the son who bears the promise of God, who bears the inheritance that Abraham was carrying, the covenant of God. And also he made it clear and open and official that with Abimelech that this well, it belongs to Abraham. Then that was the reason why Abraham could stay in the land for a long time without any issue, for peacefully. So this is today's message. I bless you all to learn from the wisdom of Abraham and build your life beautifully and fruitfully, and make a spiritual decision and do not make impatient decisions. I bless you all, and goodbye.